Hello again. In this video I will explain the UML chat system analysis, but we will be focusing on the receiving file task. So let's begin. So in this first diagram it is shown the use case. So basically we have two actors that are the user and the remote application, and there are four main use cases that are the connection, the chat, the transfer file, and the disconnection. However, as I mentioned before, we will be focusing on the receiving file task that belongs to the transfer file use case. So first, I would like to explain very quickly the sending file activity to have a better context of this system sending and receiving. However, I will let you a link below where a better explanation of this task. So the user will send a file with a path file to the chat system, and also a destination that is an integer type. The chat system will process this information and will send a signal file to the remote application. It is very important that we have in mind this remote application. Now let's discuss the receiving file task. As I mentioned before, we will start with the remote application. That's why I mentioned that it was important to have this, that we kept in mind this actor. So the remote application will send a signal of type file to the chat system. This signal has a REM contact and data. The chat system processes this information and sends a signal of type reg file to the user. In this node, we can see the attributes or parameters of this diagram, and we can see very fast that, for example, REM contact, it's a contact type, data is a string, the message file is also a string. In this class diagram, it's important to mention that the chat system is divided or is composed by three different components. That is the chat graphical user interface, the chat controller, and a chat NI. And we can see that those three components are related to each depending on their relations. So here we have the objects that I would like to analyze very quickly. So let's remind that we have the remote app and two user objects that are interacting in this diagram. So the remote app sends a signal file, as we saw earlier, with a contact and a string, and to user sends a file sends a signal reg file, as we can see here. So here in this receiving file design diagram, we can see the objects, the different objects with their respective lifeline, and those boxes represent the amount of time or unit of time that they are active. So the remote application sends a signal file with those parameters. The chat NI will execute a new file the new file function that is here, that basically concatenates different attributes and sends that signal to the chat controller. The chat controller executes also a function, but this time is a refresh file that it is basically a string, and that signal will be sent to the chat graphical user interface, and finally the user will receive a signal of type REC file signal. Finally, for this video, I just want to mention for the machine state diagram that here, when the system is listening, a state is a file, can be a file, and will execute this function that we saw in the previous slide. So this is all for my side. Thank you very much.